Howdy historians, Mr. Montgomery coming to you with a flip lesson for AP US History. Today we are working on Unit 6, Part 2, the Gilded Age and Gilded Age politics, typically seen as the years 1873 to 1896. To start it off today, I'm actually going to read a short passage from the Almanac of American History by James Miller and John Thompson, because I think it does a nice job of introducing some of the Gilded Age ideas and talking about some of the problems that were present during the period. So I begin, quote, in 1873, Mark Twain and journalist Charles Dudley Warner co-authored a satirical novel about Washington life that gave the late 19th century in America its indelible name, The Gilded Age. This was not the first time in American history that corruption ran amok, nor was it the last. An argument can be made, though, that seldom was dishonesty in American public life more blatant, nor did the gap ever yawn more widely between untaxed wealth and the modest incomes of working and middle-class people. There was no income tax. Federal revenues came mainly from tariffs, excise taxes, and the sale of public lands. Virtually every citizen had its political boss at the head of a crooked machine. New York City's notorious Tammany Hall was only the best known of the kind. Most state legislatures were cesspools of corruption in which large corporations freely bought favors. Oil company bosses did everything they wanted to the Pennsylvania legislature, someone quipped, except refine it. Many congressmen were openly on the take. Until the Pendleton Act of 1883, patronage controlled almost all federal jobs, down to the local postmasterships. End quote. So as we can see here, lots of corruption. That's what this somewhat lengthy quote is showing us in politics. And we will look at some of this corruption, but we're going to look at it more holistically on a larger scale. So lots of problems going on in the country that aren't going to be addressed. So lots of corruption between our government and big business. We have our halls. This is Boss Tweed right here and his Tammany Hall ring. In Milwaukee, it was the Turner Hall ring that controlled politics. Lots of corruption of railroads, hurting small farmers and small businesses. Also, this is the age of Plessy versus Ferguson and Jim Crow segregation in the South. So lots of unaddressed problems going on and lots of political corruption at hand. All right, so you know what to do. Get all this stuff done. Pause it and look at it if you need a second with it. Here is the section of the lecture outline that we'll be covering. Now, a quick disclaimer here. When you look at 2D and E, segregation, Plessy versus Ferguson, we covered that well in Unit 6, Part 1, so we won't be looking at that in this section. We're going to gloss over it. Also, in 3C and D, Women and African Americans for Cultural and Intellectual Movements, we are going to save that for Unit 6, Part 3, Industrialization and Urbanization, because they just fit better there. So that way you are on the same page as me as we start to hop into it here. So here we go. As we start to talk about Gilded Age politics, the big thing that we can tell from our intro there is that corruption ruled the day. Politics really lacked substance in this period. They were very diluted. The presidents of this era are oftentimes called the forgotten presidents because they were somewhat forgettable. They didn't get a lot done, but as the time goes on, they get a little more action-based as we get later into the period. But largely, politicians ignored the problems of African Americans, farmers, industrialization, urbanization, and others. Really, politics were about winning office, holding your office, and then dishing out jobs for the party using that patronage or spoil system. So because politics were about holding office and dishing out jobs, and also elections were very close, we didn't see a lot of substance because you didn't want to take a very strong stand in an election because that may lose you the election, and then you're not able to dish out patronage jobs for the people who have supported you. But because these elections were also pretty close, they led to somewhat divided governments that didn't get a lot done. There were very dirty tactics in campaigning, very consistent voting patterns. About 80% of the voting populace hit the polls in presidential elections, which is very high. We'll see Republicans dominate the White House, but Congress is constantly flip-flopping and going back and forth. And again, campaigns are about winning elections, so the goal is just don't alienate your voters instead of winning them over. Both parties had very strong organization, and then of course you had your political parties that were, your political machines that were operating too. New York City's notorious Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed is the best known, stealing the modern equivalent of probably billions of dollars from the taxpayers and not doing a lot to help the people in these cities and in these states. Lots of corruption, bribes, kickbacks, shady favors, open buying of politicians. What we can see in this top political cartoon is a number of different industry trusts, ruling over the Senate, because many senators and congressmen were straight bought by these people, so they owed them favors because they would pay for their campaigns, they would pay for their homes. Lots of open bribery that, of course, really took away the voice of the American people and ruined some of our political system in this time. The number one focus in politics was all about economics. That was the focus. So the tariff was the number one issue of this time period. Both parties favored the tariff because their supporters and businesses did as well, except for farmers. Farmers get hurt by tariffs because it hurts their ability to sell their products abroad, and it also makes them buy more expensive farm equipment back home. But tariffs were a major source of revenue for the government, and the fact that this was the most important issue shows the lack of real meaningful legislation at the time. There was also a debate at this time about currency. Should it be hard money, like gold and silver coins, or should it be soft money, like paperback bills? Hard money doesn't inflate. Soft money does. Hard money is typically backed by gold. Soft money is typically backed by silver. And what we saw here is that farmers and people in the West typically favored more silver soft money because they wanted the price to inflate, so that way they could pay back their debt with less money. They didn't want it would be easier for them to pay back their debt. On the other side, the business class, the urban class, wanted more hard money, so that way they didn't lose money on the loans that they had given. So we started to see a little bit of a debate here between urban and rural America that's going to continue on and become more pressing from 1896 to 1820. We also saw a great deal of corporate expansion at this time. Businesses were growing in number, size, and profit, and as these profits and size increased and the number increased, so did their influence on the government. Bribes for politicians were the norm. Most politicians listened to their business partners more than their constituents. And these were blatant bribes. There were campaign donations, but they were also just some blatant bribes going on. And the power that big business had really outpaced the power of the vote at this time. And we'll talk more about this corporate expansion, the industrialization portion of Unit 6, Part 3. But corporate expansion also shows an expansion of their power and influence over the government. And the number one, mechanism here, the idea towards the economy, is all about laissez-faire capitalism, something we've talked about a lot, that business should be left to the invisible hand and the impersonal economic forces of supply and demand. So, the idea here is that if the government stays out, business would be motivated by their own self-interest to offer improved goods and services at low prices. But the thing that was going on here is that this wasn't necessarily true. Tariffs and federal subsidies, businesses were more than happy to have these, but then any type of government regulation, they preach about laissez-faire principles. Well, a tariff is a very good example of not allowing the invisible hand to work. So although farmers and workers and middle class often suffered because of these policies, they just felt that it wasn't the way to do things. We'll see a couple calls for reform after President Garfield was assassinated in 1881. The Pendleton Act will come in 1883 to establish the Civil Service Commission, which will start to straighten out some of the problems of patronage. And we'll see a few limited calls there, but unfortunately not a ton of momentum for starting to change the way that things were going. So again, just to reinforce this a little bit more, lots of corruption in our government. The relation to big business was very extreme. Bribes and campaign contributions. We've learned about the many scandals and kickback schemes, the Credit Mobilier affair, the Gold Fist scheme. Politicians were owning businesses and passing legislation to benefit themselves. So there was lots of corruption in government. The Pendleton Act started to, reduce it a little bit, but eventually what we started to see, especially out west in farmers, was more demand for public control, especially when it came to utilities like electric companies and railroads. Corruptions in railroads and utilities were widespread. The rates for these things fluctuated and hurt small farmers. Like for railroads, big shippers could get rebates and foreign pools to bring their rates down by buying in bulk, but small shippers couldn't use these tricks and were forced to pay very high rates that left them with little to no profits. The stock schemes also hurt stock prices. They increased speculations. They had negative impacts overall. And although there was a demand here, not a lot got done. Railroads straight bought politicians. So that way when they got elected, the railroads would own them, or the utilities would own them. They also earned the journalists, the judges, the state legislators and legislatures. So there was not a lot they could do, even though there was this demand for public control. What we're eventually going to see is the Granger movement rise up and the populists. And we'll start to see some changes after 1896 and especially after 1900 when it comes to this corruption in government and the relation to big business. One positive we saw at this time was the establishment of the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887. Again, this is something you guys have defined. There's 4 different parts to it. Make sure you have each one. They prohibited rebates in pools and required railroads to publish the rates openly. 1, they got rid of unfair discrimination against shippers. 2, they outlawed charging for short haul more than a long haul over the same line. That's 3. And then most importantly, they created the Interstate Commerce Commission to administer and enforce this new legislation. You can make legislation, but you better have an enforcement arm if you want it to actually work. And then again, I mentioned this before, we're not going to talk about segregation in Plessy versus Ferguson in detail here, but those are 2 more great examples of problems that are occurring that aren't being addressed due to the amount of corruption that's taking place in the government. So we have all these problems, they're not being addressed. Politicians are getting their pocket lined by railroads, utilities, big business. And although the American people are participating a lot, there wasn't a big push to change a lot of these things because people felt that it wasn't the American way to do things. And they were also somewhat naive to some of the real problems that they face when it came to corruption in government and just the diluted politics of the Gilded Age that we talked about on the previous slide as well. It was just the way things were, and people didn't challenge it too much. But they will, starting after 1896. They just had to build that momentum to get there. Now, the last thing I want to talk about are some cultural and intellectual movements during this time. One of them really reinforces the ideas that were going on in the Gilded Age and industrialization, social Darwinism. So I'm sure that many of you know about Charles Darwin's theory about evolution and natural selection and survival of the fittest. Well, this started to be used by economic conservatives to justify their practices. So as an English social philosopher, Herbert Spencer, who was the most influential social Darwinist, and he thought the ideas of natural selection and survival of the fittest should be applied to the marketplace and to society in general. He didn't see a problem with the wealth of nations being consolidated to the hands of a few quote-unquote fit individuals. There was a professor at Yale University, Professor William Graham Sumner, also said that helping the poor was misguided and that the fit need to rise and those who are unfit need to be left behind. And he actually stated that helping the poor interfered with the laws of natural selection and would only weaken the evolution of our species by sparing the unfit. So this is going to make a lot of sense when we look at the Gilded Age and industrial politics and industrialization as well. So we see this survival of the fittest in the marketplace, politics, and society. Now, something that came up to counter this was the social gospel. And during the 1880s and 1890s, Protestant ministers and clergy started to advocate for social justice for the poor, especially the urban poor, as our society was becoming more urbanized. Again, urbanization is something we'll talk about in Unit 6, Part 3. But what they preached we began to call the social gospel, the importance of applying Christian principle to solving problems, especially social problems caused by urbanization, poverty, capitalism. A New York minister, Walter Rauschenbusch, led the movement and worked in New York's Hell's Kitchen and inspired middle-class Protestants to start to address poverty. So one thing we can see, an underlying theme as I went through all this, is that momentum is building to start to change these things. Eventually, the political machines will be taken down. We'll start to remove some of the corruption from the Pendleton Act, aka the Civil Service Act, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Eventually, the Grangers and the populists are going to rise up. The progressives are going to rise up. The Democrats and Republicans are going to realign somewhat. And a lot of these problems actually are going to start to be solved because first they get bigger in the period of industrialization and urbanization. So as we get ready for Unit 6, Part 3, and this massive growth of industry and this massive move of Americans to the cities, we'll see that also happening while the progressive era is happening from 1900 to 1914, and that's going to fix a lot of these problems, or at least attempt to fix and partially solve a lot of these problems we just talked about. All right, so you know what to do. Make sure that you have your post-lesson questions done. Make sure that you've got everything wrapped up and ready to go when you come to class. Unfortunately, my little music music button is broken down here, so I can't play the extra credit song for you, but we'll find another way. All right, thanks. Hopefully this went well. I'll see you tomorrow. Adios.